This week we're talking about legislation, and legislation in some ways is the most important form of law because it's dominant over case law, and it is the mode of law that is created through the democratic process. But, and I think I've mentioned this before, what we actually have in the common law system is a bit of a dance between case law and legislation. We create legislation and we create it in a general way. We create it in a way that's looking forward, and it says from this point on all people will follow these rules. Case law is backward looking, and rather than being general, it's quite specific. It says this thing actually happened. What do we do about it? Because the rules aren't clear. And of course, if the rules are clear, it never gets to court, so you don't have, it's the unusual thing that to think about for cases in the first case. It's only a very unusual number of things that actually get to court. But it's then a matter of looking at the specifics and looking at the exceptions and looking at the gaps and ambiguities in the legislation. And that in turn becomes impetus for creation of new legislation if the government's not happy with the way the courts are interpreting the law. So we see a dance, a sort of a rhythm that goes back and forth between case law and legislation. So this week's all about finding legislation, understanding legislation. Same rules apply as usual. Get in, get your hands dirty, have a look, find an act that you think's interesting. Get lost. Try and find sections that are relevant. Try and find your way through it. A few of you are interested in it, I know, from your portfolios in intellectual property law. Copyright Act is probably not a good place to start because it is a terrible place to get lost in. It's worth having a look at, but have a look at it and don't be surprised if you find that it's an absolute mess to find your way around in. And there are complex reasons for this. It's very costly and time consuming to create legislation. It has to go through Parliament. You probably already know the process. Most of you have done legal studies before. So if you don't know the process, find out what the process is. So it's hard to change legislation just because it's a bit messy, or just because you're not quite happy with it. It's an extremely costly, time-consuming exercise. So as a result, our legislation is sprawling. When we do change it, we don't tend to go back and reintroduce the whole thing and tidy it up, because that's difficult to do. We patch on bits. So we start off with sections 1 to 10, and then we add section 2, A and B, and then we add section 2, A little 1, B little 2, and we get this incredibly kind of lopsided structure as we go. But that's part of the thing. That's part of the genre of legislation. It's important that you find out about that. And often looking into an act is a bit like archaeology. You've got to start digging, and you've got to look at when amendments were brought in and to understand why the changes were and what that meant for the flow of the law. Fortunately these days all the legislation is online, so it gets updated automatically. But one of the downfalls of that, I guess, is it sometimes can be hard to see the sense of the amending acts that have come along in time. And some of this legislation is quite old, and the amending acts have changed and amended multiple times, and amendments have amended the amendments. So again, I don't want to scare you off this. This is actually part of the the perverse pleasure of law is getting into this stuff and finding out and understanding and moving beyond the person you were when you start studying law, where you go, this is unfair, why don't we do something about it, to actually looking at how law works and going, okay, this is why we don't do something about it. Let's look at an issue like bullying. Why don't we pass a law to stop bullying? How do we do that? How do we draft something which is narrow enough that it actually works, broad enough that it covers all the situations, but it doesn't have unexpected consequences? So again, immerse yourself in this stuff. It's not a matter of what's the minimum I can do to get by this week. If you take that attitude, this is not the right degree to study, because you need to take initiative, you need to think about your own development, and you need to actually start thinking about developing those skills. We also do a little bit on commentary this week and articles, mainly around citation. Of course, journal articles are going to be a major important source of information for you, journal articles and textbooks. And it's important with these and everything else that you know how to access them, you know how to use them, and you know how to cite them correctly using the Australian Guide to Legal Citation.